Welcome to Inet Life. This is the Future of Work series. Today's conversation will be dedicated to examining the role and impact of technology on the economy in the past, present, and the future. My name is Katya Klinova. I lead labor and economy research programs at the Partnership on AI. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. On it are Chen, director of the Luohan Academy, Anton Korinek, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia, Darden School of Business, and John van Reenen, Professor in Management and Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. At the end of the discussion, we're going to make time for a Q&A for an audience. Please submit questions by clicking on a Q&A button at any time during the discussion. I would like to start by posing to our panel a question from the very title of the panel. Is the technology an enabler, an accelerator, or a displacer? But before I turn it over the virtual microphone to our panelists, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge what an interesting, a unique question it is, and what a unique time it is to be asking this question. This is the kind of time when on a random Tuesday, you may open a newspaper, or maybe you'll join an online event, and you'll see very respectable people making very compelling arguments for each three of these options. So it seems like we've, as society, shifted from seeing technology as a force that lifts all boats to now seemingly being unsure about its role in society and in the economy. What happened? I'd like for our panelists to reflect on this meta question. What happened and why did this happen? Is it the technology that changed and now it no longer lifts all boats? Or is it that our understanding of the role of technology in the economy that changed and became more nuanced? John, let's start with you. Where do you stand on this?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the chance to share a few thoughts on these very important questions. And of course, as a typical economist, I'm going to say all three of those things are what technology does. We'll make three quick points just to get the conversation rolling. So, fundamentally, technology is an enabler. If you look at human history and human progress, what's lifted humans out to dominate the planet has been technology and our use of knowledge. And really, a key moment of that came, during the Industrial Revolution, in the late 18th century, when we have what, economists call this hockey stick, or this kind of takeoff of productivity, a takeoff of human population to escape the trap of the Malthusian trap that when population took off in the past, eventually humans would get pushed into poverty. After the Industrial Revolution, through the use of knowledge, we managed to lift now billions of people out of poverty, improving health and improving well-being. So really, that's the number one fact. Technology has been an enabler, has been a great, it's what's made humans so successful. The second thing is that although there is a part of that which can't be predicted and is random and exogenous, part of the speed of that technological progress is, this horrible word economists like to use, endogenous growth, in the sense that we can influence the speed of that technology. And we can influence that in many ways. One is through how we organize ourselves through, for example, in the market-based economy to allow new ideas to flourish and create and, old industries to die and decline. Other ways are through investments in research and development. Bigger investments the government makes in R&D of a way of increasing the speed of technology through the intellectual property system, through other ways. The third thing is that we can influence not just the speed of technology, but also the direction it goes in, whether it is more likely to, as I hope it will do, to enskill people, give people opportunities, or whether it actually goes in the other way and actually destroys and does other things. So take one example, take climate change as a leading example of today. We can influence the way we deal with climate change by making investments in clean technologies. In the same way we made a moonshot to put men on the moon, we can make investments in order to deal with the problem of climate change. But we can also affect climate change through things like tax policy. So carbon taxes reduce people's use of and consumption of fossil fuels, but they also give incentives to the private sector to make investments in clean technologies of the future. There's lots of evidence that when you do that, you can actually shift the way that private companies invest in things because they can see where the direction of the market's going. But finally, this is my last point, we can do this at a very micro level. So when new technologies are adopted all around us, in our businesses, in our hospitals, and our schools, we can influence the way that technology is introduced through our institutions, through our negotiation, through whether we bring people with us for workers in order to just help design and implement their processes, or whether we don't. So that at the very micro level as well, there's a way we can influence the direction of that technology. So I'll end it there and hand over to my other panelists.
Thank you. Anton, how about you?
Yeah, so let me first start by saying thank you for organizing this fantastic panel. And I very much agree with the points that John raised, but I want to add also another perspective. Let's all take a step back, and I want to ask you to follow me on a thought experiment. Imagine an observer who approaches planet Earth and who is trying to figure out what's going on this strange planet, and who sees that there's lots of entities that are called humans that are interacting with each other, but there's also lots of entities that they call machines that interact with the humans and that interact with each other. And for that observer, it's more and more difficult to figure out who is actually in charge, who is in control. Are the humans in charge of the machines? Are the machines in charge of the humans? Or do they both have certain degrees of control over each other? And honestly, if we ask ourselves to answer that question objectively, we probably have to say that in today's world, our machines have taken on agency of their own, and we are no longer in full control. Our technologies are themselves agents and are very much influencing what's happening in our human realm. So from that perspective, technology is all three, but I think we also need to recognize that technology is increasingly a force on its own. And as John put it so eloquently at the end of his opening statement, we need to really think carefully about how can we steer technology while we still have some influence on it to work in a direction that we can coexist and mutually benefit from each other for hopefully as long as possible. So biologists use the term symbiosis when there is two types of beings coexisting with each other and mutually benefiting from each other. I think we're increasingly living in an area where technology and humans live in symbiosis. And I think our job at this juncture in history is to make sure that the symbiosis continues to be mutually beneficial.
Thank you. Challenging us no less. Long, what's your take on this question?
Okay, so firstly, thank you very much for giving me the chance to share my thoughts. And I think it's important, and that I want to remind all of us that our views are shaped by what we observe. And so I'm going to add to this discussion by presenting a bunch of facts, what we observe in China, and some logic behind it. Now, so I'm going to say that I'm going to focus on digital technology and what's its impact on China thus far. So I'm going to say that it's obviously technology, its impact of all the three roles, but this time I think it's particularly interesting in terms of the direction and its impact on the inclusion. Let me give you some concrete numbers, cases. So if we think about, because what I observed is that in the United States, it's actually quite different. I couldn't think about, so we have eBay, but it's not probably that big. It's a company. And Amazon it buys stuff and sells. So it's really a company. And so eBay's platform is not that big. But in China, if you think about e-commerce, now 10 years ago, e-commerce its online consumption was about actually 1% of the China's retail sales. So it was below the average of many, below that of many of the advanced countries. But now by now it accounts for about 25% of the retail sales in China. So it has become a macro phenomenon. So, and if you only look at Alibaba as example, on Alibaba's Taobao.com, so every month we have more than 700 million active users shopping every day online. And on the other side, we have more than 10 million SMEs and startups serving all those users. And for those startups, half of the entrepreneurs are women. And for those, so that's, I'm talking about the scope of the inclusion we're talking about here. So Alibaba is trying to connect them to each other. And for those entrepreneurs, more than 10 million entrepreneurs, so we have if we talk about micro lending, so in the past several years, the My Bank has provided micro lending for more than 20 million SMEs, and without a penny of collateral, because in the words of the Professor Holmstrom, information is the new collateral. Now, and if we look at some more inclusion patterns, if we look at the less developed regions, consumers they spend proportionally no less online than the more advanced regions. Then also, but they buy much more varieties because they don't have big supermarkets to go to, and the growth rate is also faster. And so the most active people using the e-commerce or the mobile payment. Mobile payment right now in China is like the hundreds times of that of the United States. I think we have more than 1 billion active mobile payment users, but so that has become very inclusive. So that's my first point. Is the role is obviously of all three, but from China's point of view, it's quite different from what we observed from United States. That's the first point I want to share. I think it's particularly probably it's possible to be inclusive this time. My second point is that I want to bring up a different view. Sometimes we talk about the superstar firms, but which is true, obviously, in the digital age. But there's another angle is the size of the market. So because right now, what digital technology really does is to break the traditional boundary of the market. So now the small Papa and Mama stores can serve the average distance between the buyer and sellers is about 1,000 kilometers. So because of that, I think it's the size of the market has never been so big. Now, in the case of Alibaba, it's the operator of the market. So then the market becomes so big. That's why they grow simultaneously. So my point here is that, and I'm echoing what John talked about earlier, that is when we think about the role of technology, the direction of technology, it could be a superstar firm. It could also be a size of the market. There's a couple of angles to look at it. But the last example I want to bring up, because you guys talk about the climate change, but let me talk about one good example, which is actually a product we created in my office several years ago. So back in 2016, we tried to do something for climate change. So we want to, so beyond inclusion, what can we do for the green to make the people to be more aware of their green behavior? So we started to come up with this idea called Ant Forest. So essentially, we use the big data and the tracking technology to track the users upon the approval, track their carbon footage. So let's say, John, you decided that today you won't drive to work. You decide to take a subway. That will lead to a reduction of the carbon usage, and that will show up in Alipay. Now, people as a little green ball, people can collect those green balls, or they collect from friends. That leads to a healthy competition. But anyway, that's fun. So when doing that, a little tree in Alipay will grow, a virtual tree. But when that tree grows into a full tree, then a real tree will be planted in the deserted areas where the plantation is needed. So that was a little game little gain in Alipay, but that has become one of the most successful application on Alipay. So within 1 year, right now we have more than 500 million users subscribed to it, and so what that really means, and we have planted more than 100 million trees, and so what this really says is that every day more than 3-4% of the population on Earth, they're watching their green behavior, and they are actually planting trees every day. It's not just their own action in the carbon reduction, but also in the meantime, they are actually planting trees every day. So I'm trying to use this example to say that it is possible for the digital technology to be very inclusive, to have the good, meaningful purposes. But last point is that I think sometimes we worry about the replacement, displacement. So I just want to remind us that globally, we don't observe more digitized countries have higher unemployment rate. So I think that, but there's obviously a lot of the displacement going on because the digital age is known for its innovation. So it's also a huge task trying to minimize its shocks. My point here is that from our actual experience in China, I surely believe technology is an enabler in the long run, but I think particularly it's more hopeful this time, even in the short run. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. So I would like to expand and spend some more time on this last point that you're bringing up, which I think is very important. Indeed, we haven't seen huge spikes in technological unemployment around the world. And hearing these numbers from China is just really impressive. At the same time, I am right now in the United States, and there is a lot of conversation in both academic circles and in the media about the so-called hollowing out of the middle class and middle-paying jobs and polarization in the labor market. And a lot of people attribute that to technological change and the technological change being skill-biased and creating more opportunities for people with certain kinds of elite degrees, but diminishing economic opportunities and access to them for everyone else. So how do we think about that? Is it indeed something related to technological change? And if automation is not a new phenomenon at all, why is it that we've only been seeing this hollowing out of the middle-paying jobs in the last few decades and not before? Anton, would you like to start with this?
Yeah, very happy to. So first, let me say it's really interesting to listen to Long, because I think it is true that the perspective of what China has experienced in the past 2 decades is really quite different from what most of the Western world, especially the US, have experienced. And the way I want to put it is that technological displacement does not show up in unemployment, but it shows up in wages. The reason for that is that economists put it by saying that labor supply is fairly inelastic. Intuitively, what it means is people want jobs no matter what. So if there is technological displacement, it puts downward pressure on wages. It doesn't really create a lot of unemployment. And what we have seen in the US, as Katya has mentioned, is that there has really been a lot of downward pressure on the wages of lesser skilled workers. And I think that has really led to a significant problem when it comes to inequality, but more broadly speaking, also to significant societal problems like deaths of despair, as Case and Deaton have described, and even political problems, because it has led to so much discontent. So I think this technological displacement, it is happening in certain parts of the world, and it is having very real and very destructive impacts. Thank you, Katya.
Yeah, can I just build on that? Yeah, so I mean, Mike, I've worked, most of my life on these issues, and my colleague David Autor as well has really been a pioneer in this. And I think I'm totally on board with what Anton is saying. I mean, I think in the popular discussion, it's all about robots destroying jobs and causing unemployment, and I think that's the wrong way to think of it. We should be focusing more on the quality of jobs and the quantity of jobs. I mean, again, the history teaches us there's lots of different technological advances that hasn't led to ever-growing unemployment. What it has led to is the change in the way that we work, and also the kind of inequalities that Anton has mentioned. And I think the way to think about this is that if you think about what automation and digitization does, it makes first of all, in the first generation, it made routine tasks a lot easier to automate. So if you think about the 1920s, working on the production line, those type of jobs were the first ones which went from being production line jobs and making cars to robots making those lines. And that was the unskilled manual workers suffering. But then as it went on, routine jobs, if you thought about it, my mother worked as a bank clerk, and her job when she was in the bank was, people would come in and she'd give them money, and she'd they'd write checks and she'd give them money. But it was a very routine job. So it's kind of clerical jobs was the next kind of wave of displacements. So she was like, a middle-class worker, but, now her job is done by an ATM machine. So that started reducing the demand for jobs, routine jobs in the middle of the skill distribution. And this is the kind of hollowing out and polarization that you've seen. And, now, of course, as I'm sure we'll talk about this, the worry is that even more types of jobs, even the less routine jobs, may actually be automated. Driving a car we thought was a very non-routine type of job, but maybe that is something which can now be taken over, as we've seen, by driverless cars. So maybe that's the next generation of where we've seen displacement. But I do think the way we should frame this debate is really thinking about how we deal with improving the quality of jobs and dealing with that kind of displacement. So I think we really have to think about how we support people's wages, how we think about the kind of labor standards of people who are working in different types of jobs, especially now that jobs have become more fragmented and with the gig economy. And we have to think about how we can, in the implementation of those new technologies, we can create opportunities for job ladders. So I mean, as Anton says, the real failing in the United States has been the stagnation of wages of less skilled workers. And we really need to think about ways we provide paths that those less skilled workers can get more skills and also can have pathways to kind of decent and sustainable jobs. And I take, in addition to that, in fact, particularly over the last period since the global financial crisis, we've also seen stagnation of general average wages, not just in the US, but also in many other countries. And my view is that's actually related, we had the sense of this amazing technological progress, but if you look at the productivity numbers are actually pretty disappointing. Productivity growth has actually slowed down since the global financial crisis. So I think there's a real question over, if that's true, that has, wage growth depends on productivity growth. If we're not getting productivity growth, we're not getting wage growth. If we're not getting wage growth, we get huge social and political problems of the sort that we've seen in Europe and the United States over the last 10 years. So yeah, I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. Long, would you like to add anything? It would be really great to hear from you if you think this is not happening in China because fundamentally there is something that you figured out that the rest of the world needs to learn, or maybe this is just a question of time before this starts happening as well.
Well, let me emphasize again that we should be careful, and I think we should really look at facts and be careful about how to interpret the facts. So the first fact I want to talk about that China's labor share of income is rising. In contrast to the United States or Europe. So that's one fact. So I think this will be a little bit different from emerging markets. Emerging markets are going through the industrialization and the digitization at the same time. And the industrialization itself will actually disrupt a lot of the informal sectors. But in that meantime, they have the digital technology. They goes to the online, they can do a lot of things. So what this is, I think for emerging markets, including China, so that might be a little bit different. So that's the first fact I want talking about. But the second point, I think And I agree with some. I think it's Anton talk about it. So it's the. I think it's the. This is happening in certain areas, and that's the key. That is the reason. I think the thing is this. The stagnation is more complicated than probably we thought, because it's not immediately clear that it's the technology that's causing the stagnation of the middle class in the United States. And so if you look at the Piketty talk about, and some other people talk about, maybe it's the global trade or other things, it's the capital market, but there are many possible reasons. Technology might be one, is the hypothesis, but I think stagnation is a fact, but how to interpret this is probably more complicated. And finally, the productivity itself, I think that's another interesting thing. And I think the GDP related to that and the productivity as a measure is becoming more and more outdated. There's a rise of the intangible economy. And that is actually measurable. If we look at the more digitized industries, actually the market price versus the book value, the gap become bigger and bigger, and much less digitized become much less so. And so there's a lot of consumer surplus, a lot of free goods that are not captured by the GDP or the traditional productive measures. So again, I think we're facing a lot of the measurement issues, and also the facts are kind of different in different regimes, and also interpretation is kind of complicated.
Thank you. Fascinating to be looking at it from both sides of the world. I'd like to return to something that was also mentioned by Luohan, the superstar firms and their role in driving technological progress and innovation. And again, there are quite opposing views here. One can argue that having superstar firms is extremely beneficial. There is a reason they're called superstars, and their performance indeed has been really impressive. And they've brought opportunity to many people to expand the market reach that they have, to be local entrepreneurs with global reach, for example. But there are also people who argue, well, there are very few of them, and they're increasingly dominating the markets in which they're acting, and they might be stifling innovation quite a bit. So how should we think about this? Where is the truth in this debate? Anyone who'd like to start?
I mean, this is the kind of area which I'm very passionate about, because I've been it is the area I've been working on a lot recently. So yeah, I like Long's fact. So let's start with the fact. So I think in the US, it's pretty clear, as you say, Katya, that one of the really striking things is the growth of these superstar firms. That you see that, in the digital space, especially, they go by different names, but the GAFAs I like. In GAFA in English means like boss. So the GAFAs, the Googles, the Amazon, the Facebooks, the Apples and the Microsofts, they've got they're enormous firms. They've got a lot bigger. But even if you look at the fraction of employment, so if you take the fraction of employment in firms with more than 5,000 employees, that's increased from like 26% to 33% since the mid-'80s in the US. And if you look at the sales footprint of these firms, it's even larger. And indeed, if you look across a wide range of US markets, concentration has risen. So, it really does seem to be that markets are increasingly dominated by the small number of firms. But, there's different explanations. So I think Long gave one explanation, which is to do with globalization, that markets are just bigger. And, as the markets become bigger, then there is increasingly a winner-takes-all type of nature to those markets. If you've got a better product, you're going to be able to dominate a bigger market much more efficiently than if you're a smaller firm. So part of this could be a force of globalization and increased competition. Part of it could be network effects. If you Google search engines, the more people search, the more data you get, the bigger you get. So it could be that kind of network effect. It could be the intangible economy. So in fact, you see this phenomenon not just in the digital space. So you see this in like retail and wholesale. And I think part of this is this intangible economy. I call it the Walmart effect. If Walmart's built up its strength because it's been able to make these enormous investments in having logistics software, which enables it to move its goods around. Much, a mom and pop or a small chain cannot make the kind of hundreds of millions of dollars investments. So those are all the kind of, technological positive stories, or at least neutral stories. The more worrying story, I think, is that, and I think this, I think in some markets, I would say that the technology and globalization are the dominant reasons for this. But in some markets, and I'm thinking of things like US hospital markets or parts of the airline industry or US telecommunications, you also see prices, markups going up and prices going up. So I think that in some markets, it is firms exploiting their market power. I think it's not the dominant story why these superstars have become superstars, but I think it has happened in some markets. And I also think that when we look forward, we should always look forward. Competition policy looks backwards too much, and what we should do when we think about mergers and acquisitions is to look forward. And the risk is that many of these very powerful firms will be able to abuse their market power because they're so large. An example would be of a dominant digital platform which buys up a promising startup, and then once it's bought that startup, either absorbs its technology or even kills its technology off. There's examples in the pharmaceutical industry of big pharma firms buying up promising startups and actually killing their technologies off, the so-called killer acquisitions. So I think that we have to really reimagine the whole way we do antitrust policy in order to really prevent, some of these very dominant firms, becoming too powerful. So I think it's the reason that they become powerful is to do with technology and globalization primarily. But I think now, as we look forward, we have to think, in all countries, how we prevent them building up walls and moats to prevent other startups from displacing them. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face across many countries at this point in time.
Thank you.
If I may, let me add to John's points, which I very much agree with. And I will start with a semantic point and then some more substance. So the semantic point is that superstars makes this sound really great. They are super, they're stars. Perhaps we should call them super monopolists. So from my perspective, technology is indeed the major driver behind this phenomenon. And in fact, digital goods, and our world is more and more digitally dominated, are by their very nature non-rivalrous. So that means the provision of digital goods is a natural monopoly. That means we cannot really get around the fact that these providers of digital goods will have some monopoly power. That's the only way to provide these goods because the marginal cost is zero, so it means we cannot have a competitive market providing them. But what we really need, as Chen has emphasized, is we need proper regulation, because that's what we do in all other areas where we have natural monopolies. When it comes to, let's say, electricity networks, water lines, and so on. And we really need to view the digital economy through the same prism of natural monopolies. And then maybe the last point to connect it to the broader issue of agency is that some of these superstar monopolies have accumulated so much power that they are arguably more influential for the world than most nation states. If you're a small country somewhere around the world, chances are that Google and Facebook and so on are more powerful than you. And they are also more powerful than most individual citizens. And that just highlights again how we really need to be very careful in thinking how many rights we assign to these entities and how strictly we want to regulate them to make sure that the technology does become an enabler for humanity and not a displacer. Thank you, Katya.
Thank you. Long, would you like to jump in as well?
Yeah, so I will continue to take a slightly different view, and I think I will stick to the facts. And I think as I mentioned in the beginning, because what we observe from the United States is actually quite different. Because when I think about the United States, it's possible that the superstar firms we're talking about, they're actually firms. and that's one fact. But as I mentioned, in China, so there are two angles to look at this. One is look at this as a firm. Another is as the operator of the market. And that's, if it's operator of the market, the size actually represents the scope of the coordination. I already gave very concrete numbers to see if you connect hundreds of millions of people together and tens of millions of the startups, SMEs, somebody has to do it. If the market has become so big, and so that's a different angle. So my point, I'm not trying to defend for all of this so-called big tech superstar firms. I'm just trying to remind there's different angles to look at this, that different species of those tech firms that play different roles. Now, and the second point is this dominance, the competition policy we're kind of worried about. But then that, again, is a little bit different in different regimes. In China, in some of the most advanced regimes, the sectors, for example, in e-commerce, Alibaba was, of course, was a starter of the e-commerce in China. Its market share has been steadily going down, even though China's online consumption is growing as a percentage is going up and up. So e-commerce becomes much more diversified. This company called Pinduoduo, it actually, in the past 3-4 years, it's starting from the startup. Now it has more than probably 400 million users and going up very quickly within several years. And that's for the e-commerce. Payment is another example. So we have Alipay is initially was like a leader for the mobile payment, but now we have the other payment, mobile payments, and the Alipay's market share is going down quickly in a healthy way. Now it's growing, but the share is going down a lot. Another example is advertisement. Now, Baidu used to be it's the search company, it's the Google in China. So that used to be the big data company dominant. It will actually have much bigger market cap than Alibaba, Tencent, other companies, but now become much smaller. And think about the TikTok, the hot topic nowadays we'll talk about. Now TikTok has, its parent company took over Baidu as the advertisement revenue. My point here is that I think it's very hard for those companies to sleep. And there's fierce competition for sure in most of the industries I'm looking at. So I'm trying to remind my colleagues and the audience here that there's different perspective. And finally, I think when we think about issues, we should not forget about the meaning of competition policy. What's the point of talking about this? Is it getting more or less competitive? Is it promoting competition, or is blocking competition? Or are we bringing more consumer surplus to the market? So those are the things we have to think about in the meantime when we think about the so-called superstar firms. Again, it's kind of complicated. It's different in different regions, different industries. Globally, we have different angles. I'll stop here.
So can I? I mean, just following up exactly this point. I mean, I'm often involved in these conversations, arguing against people who are saying, this is all of this is terrible, and these mega firms, let's call them rather, superstar firms are wicked monopolists exploiting their market power. And for all that, I think we're kind of in agreement. That's too naive approach. If you look at the sectors which have become more concentrated and dominated, they are the ones that Long and Anton will be talking about. They're the ones with a lot of innovation, a lot of activity. They're not the ones where prices are going up. However, I do think that we have to be careful, because it is the case that there are a lot of forces. Anton gave one example of the way that in many of these network industries they are almost like natural monopolies. Once you get an advantage, it is harder for a new entrant to come in and get the scale that you have, because you have these network effects supporting you. And there are, I think there are the way that we often think about competition policy and the way it's done in practice is that, at least in America and Europe, is that we say, well, here's one firm taking over another firm. This other firm has like 1% market share, so the fact, it's being taken over, it doesn't really matter. It's too small to make a difference. But if that tiny firm could have become the new platform threat to Google or Facebook, then it's a potential competitor of the future. And under the normal antitrust rules, those mergers, those acquisitions will be waved through. But we think about, say, the Facebook WhatsApp takeover or the Facebook Instagram takeover. I'm very concerned that when those takeovers happen, those innovations which could have become the new platform threats don't become the new platform threats. And I think that we need to kind of shift at the moment, the burden of proof is all on the government or the regulators to say, why we think this might be a threat. And it's very hard because we don't have many facts because these are all future markets. But unless we actually do engage in that, that prospective competition perspective, then I think that's going to give the very large firms even stronger power to remain dominant. Now, China, of course, I'm no expert on China, but my impression of China is that there are a lot of very big firms which are very strong, and there's a lot of connections between the states and these firms. So I wouldn't be too relaxed that everything is completely fierce competition. I think there are risks of competition being undermined whenever you get very very large firms. And there's a connection between this and what happens in labor market. So one of the features of these very big firms is that they typically have high profits and low shares of labor. So one of the reasons for the fall of the labor share in the United States is that more and more of the economy has become dominated by these mega firms, these superstar firms, and that's been a force for, as David Alter and I have shown in our work, for pushing down the overall share of labor. So I think there are lots of reasons that we can't be too relaxed about allowing the market to take care of itself. In order to have dynamic markets, the state has to be dynamic. The state also has to be involved with creating the competitive landscape and framework to allow fierce competition to take place.
Can come back on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll actually would like for us to stay a little bit on this topic of superstar firms, but pivot it a little bit to talk about the responsibilities of mega firms or superstar firms. But before I do that, I'd like to remind our audience that we're approaching a moment when we're going to turn to their questions. We've been receiving some really terrific questions, and please keep them coming. We're going to turn to that in just a moment. So thinking about the responsibilities of the mega firms, and this is the question that I'll confess I grapple with every single day in relation to my work on the Shared Prosperity Initiative at the Partnership on AI. So these are the firms that really can direct technological progress, this notion that John was mentioning in the beginning. So they do have a power to be creating the kind of economy that is more inclusive and more just and provides access to different people, not only people with certain kinds of education, and can be more inclusive, the point that Long was making. So if you could direct technological change, if you were that decision maker, where would you direct it? How would you be making the technological choices? And what is the responsibility of the firms to do that, if any? So Long, maybe we'll start with you on this, and you can also expand on the point that you wanted to mention. Thank you.
Right. So I'm not trying to defend for all the tech firms. I just think that, and I understand that a lot of people feel uncertain and some of people feel terrible. And I understand that. I'm just trying to think that we need a different views about the way we coordinate in the digital age. And so beyond just firm versus market, there's some other species now, because that, for example, again, think about Alibaba. Alibaba is a company, but on the platform, there's more than 10 million SME startups and more than 100 million consumers. So this is a market. So it's not just about the firms. So anyway, they need to be regulated. I agree, but we just needs a different take in the digital age. That's my point. And also because of the digital technology actually changed the relation between the consumer and producers. And producers do not need to make money on every piece of product anymore. So there's a lot of free products. And also on the platforms. It's actually to the platforms' incentive to promote a lot of the innovations. So that's how make a platform, a market prosper. And also, as I already give you example to see that even in China, in many of those platforms, there's a lot of competitions. It's very hard to sleep. And so I already mentioned that I don't think the share of the labor is going down if you think this as a market rather than as a firm. And finally, but let me come back to a point. I agree with you that responsibility is a key issue, because inevitably, when the scope of the coordination are going up, then if you have those platforms, they have to show them more responsibility, and the governance. And so that is also something a little bit different. So for Alibaba, maybe it's just because of Jack Ma's where he came from. He failed many times when he has a startup. And so the whole the mission of Alibaba is to make the business easy anywhere. So it has been the same for the past 20 years. But Alibaba just one example. I'm not trying to talk about this as a company. It's just I think there are many ways. And the point here is that tech firms, they have a bigger responsibility and have bigger power, and that's for sure. And we can shaping them in the right direction. And also, but we also need to have a different views to think about them. They need to be governed, regulated, but probably it's not exactly the same in the industrial age.
Thank you. John, Anton, any words on the responsibility of the mega firms and ways we can direct technological change? Yes.
Let me maybe start with a shout out to Katya, because she's doing really interesting and exciting work on this topic at the Partnership on AI with the Shared Prosperity Initiative, where they are working on a framework that basically lays out how firms can consciously steer the development of technologies to be more labor using. Now, I want to focus on two aspects that the presence of these superstar firms in this sector implies for this effort of steering technological progress. First, it really raises the stake. Since the superstar firms are such important actors in the space, what an individual firm of that caliber does really has repercussions around our economy, around our world. And that's why it is really important that the superstar firms are conscious of what's going on, conscious how their choice of technologies and their decisions on how to innovate will affect us not only in the product sphere, but also in the labor market, and how they will impact whether labor is being more displaced or more complemented in the marketplace. Now, the second point, which is actually very positive, is that since they are natural monopolies, they are drawing a significant source of profits, which allows them to invest in moonshot projects, and a lot of them do. And if they consciously steer those moonshot projects in directions that actually help society by enabling and empowering labor rather than just displacing labor, then I think a lot of good can be done. Thank you, Katya.
So very quickly building on those points, I mean, it's absolutely correct to say that because these companies are so large, they have a lot of responsibility to try and do things which are for the good of society. And I think economists are somewhat to blame for the idea that shareholder value is the only thing which actually matters, whereas I think in reality there are a number of stakeholders, and it's actually often in the company's own interest to take those into account, rather than just trying to maximize shareholder value. So trying to think about involving workers on the board or other aspects I think is very important. Having said that, I think it would be naive to expect firms to do all the things which are in the good of society. We know that will not be the case, So I think governments have important responsibilities to try and maintain what's for the good of the social good, which needs curbing the power of some of these firms and maintaining competition. And I think the problem is that we face today is that states are small relative to many of these companies. So in order to counterbalance the power, you need coordination across many countries. Of course, the direction of travel is the opposite now, with increasingly countries putting up walls. And in fact, what we need is greater cooperation to deal with making companies pay their fair share of tax, making sure that they are obeying competition rules, trying to do some kind of regulation which has to be transnational, not in one single country.
Can I come back a little bit? 30 seconds.
Yes, quickly, and then we'll switch to audience Q&A. Thank you.
So, you see, I agree with John and the both of Anton. And so I guess my point here is that I'm emphasizing again that we shouldn't be simplistic, because when I'm listening to this, I'm hoping to hear a voice that we're going to come back to the nature of those so-called superstar firms. Exactly what are they serving? Is that the right direction? Because I think the direction is inevitable. We're going to have a lot of coordination. Somebody has to do it. It's just what's the right way. Probably we should think more rather than just think we're going to do something. So that's my point. But again, I'm going to cite facts. When Alibaba went public, it says clearly that its mission is the customer first, employee second, and shareholders third. It says in its IPO statement, and if you don't like it, you don't need to buy it as a shareholder. So, and Alibaba's mission is to make business easy anywhere. So my point here is that it is possible for tech firms to sense that. And I don't think, and I agree with you, you shouldn't just trust the companies to do that. But I do think it is the age, because of the opportunity of coordination, it is the age to be much more inclusive. It's good for society. It's also good for the business. But I also agree with you that we need to have the society governance from policies. We all work together, firms, consumers, and governments, to make sure we're going in the right direction. But we just need to have a more integrated approach to think about these issues.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this very passionate debate, and I would keep going and going, but I also would like to get to the audience questions, because we've been receiving a few of them and they're terrific. So let's try to answer them briefly if we can, so we can get through as many as possible. So the first one, we've been talking a lot about the US and China. And the first question I'd like to pose from the audience is, what is your take on the impact of AI on solving the unemployment problem in the global south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa? Do you all see that there are opportunities to also be helping to create inclusive economy in sub-Saharan Africa, given the mega firm global influence?
So this is actually a question that I'm really concerned about, because the comparative advantage of the least developed countries in the world economy is unskilled labor. And unskilled labor is precisely what we are automating away. And that means as we are automating more and more, the least developed countries are experiencing really significant terms of trade losses. And life in the countries is becoming harder and harder. So I think when we spoke before about the responsibility of big tech companies and also of governments in advanced countries to steer progress in the right direction, this is probably one of the areas where it is most relevant for welfare, and at the same time where it's going to be the hardest.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, well, I was working with a couple of companies which were using AI to do various parts of outsourcing of their IT systems, and there was an interesting phenomena that in the first wave, you could actually outsource to areas, with a lot of routine tasks, which were in developing countries. So not as poor as sub-Saharan Africa, but like India, for example, and parts of South Asia. But as the AI becomes more sophisticated, it's, I think as Anton was saying, that you may not even need to use people, less skilled workers in the global south, and actually a lot of those jobs and activities will actually be reshored to the kind of richer countries. So I think it is going to be a challenge for many poorer nations of the world.
So let me add some facts here again. Up to now, automation is not really leading to increase of the unemployment rate. And from our experience in China and probably in other emerging markets, I think there was this fear actually, the digital technology, because before in the industrial age, there's this industrialization and people find jobs, but people worry about that digital technology can actually stop that process, especially that could have a severe implication for the emerging markets. That is not what we see in China or other countries. And what we see in China is that as billions of people are involved in being digitized, involved into this, there's a lot of more jobs created. So, but I am aware of the possibility that AI is different from automation. It's actually takes a lot of routine jobs. So I'm still watching this. I don't know what's going to happen. Thus far, we are not seeing this exactly happening yet, but it's possible.
Thank you. Next question is from Terry White, who is asking, do we need a new theorem of business or of economics for the digital world? And if I may add from myself, like, what is the clean technology or green technology for the digital technological choices? And since we are at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, what is this new economic thinking that we need around the role and responsibility of technological progress and technology companies in the economy? And maybe what is some old thinking that we already should leave behind at this point? I'd like to start.
That's a really interesting question. And in some ways, I would argue, yes, we very much do need a new conceptual framework to think about the digital economy and to think about the dynamics of economies in which AI is playing an increasing role. So the funny thing is, the bare bones of all of our economic models, think, for example, Arrow de Breu, are rooted in static exchange economies where all goods are rivalrous. And in a digital economy, that really does not apply anymore. So the first implication of that, I already briefly alluded to that earlier, is that it's very hard to have a competitive economy when you have non-rivalrous goods. And that means our very standard for an efficient market, which is the Arrow de Breu model of competitive markets, simply cannot apply. And we do have, of course, lots and lots of models to deal with that, but we haven't really figured out yet what should be our new benchmark. And we haven't figured out a way of how to deal most efficiently with that.
I mean, my view is that in economics, we have a lot of different models. I mean, I think when people think about economics, they're too obsessed with the perfectly competitive model. And most of the interesting part of economics has been on imperfect competition, both in the product market through, as Anton was saying, because of innovation and, low marginal costs and high fixed costs and models of endogenous growth. Those are all imperfect competition models, but also in the labor market. I mean, I think one of the ways that we need to really make greater advances is to think of the way in which people get paid. A lot of that depends on the firms that they work for and the degree of market power that those big companies have over paying what workers' wages are. And we don't really, although I think we have the tools there, but we need to actually use those tools more in combination with better data to understand what's happening in different industries. So I think the kind of tools are there. I don't, my view is there won't be one single canonical model. So I don't think, I don't think that we're going to get like an Arrow-Jabru model, which is going to be true everywhere. I think we're going to have to think of lots of different degrees of imperfect competitive models in different markets, which are more applicable to some industries and some areas than others. That, I think, is the way to go, and combined with much, much better data than we've ever had before. I mean, the most exciting real part of economics at the moment, in my view, is the explosion of high-quality microdata, which we can use to really test and add and understand with them, the imperfect combination models that should be the workhorse models of the modern tool in the economist toolbox.
So in my view, that the nature of the business or economy has not changed, but how we do it is going through a fundamental change. Digitization of the information is leading to the digitization of connectivity, decision making, and trust. And so that is changing how we coordinate with each other, and that is fundamentally changing our business model. But it's not exactly clear to me that the Arrow-Jabru type of model, exchange economy, is exactly changing, because what I was seeing is that there's a lot of the integrated market. What we observe in actual data is the actual price are converging for the similar goods, but there's much, much more explosion of the varieties, new species. And also we see the rise of the gig economy. So the people becomes more free. And so then there's a lot of new species coming up in between the market versus the firm, and there's another things coming up. So there's a lot of things to do, but I don't think the nature of the economics or the business is changing. And finally, that is the thing Luohan Academy is doing. So I used to be a professor like the John and Anton in the United States, but what now I'm so excited about is actually we're using the big data, and we're working with the best economists, social scientists to find the solutions, this or that. So I think this is also changing how we do research. We're breaking the traditional boundary between the theory and practice, and between the and in schools, we actually we work with a lot of the good scientists. Anyway, so that's the thing I'm so excited about, and I agree with you. There's a lot of things to work on with the big data.
We're at time. I want to thank all the panelists for a fascinating discussion, so passionate. I really enjoyed it. I hope that our audience enjoyed it as well. There is, of course, a lot more to talk about. And if you are in the mood to continue, please click on the Young Scholars Initiative link at the bottom and join the discussion in an open forum where the young scholars are going to dive deeper into some of these issues. Next Tuesday at noon, we will discuss Is This Time Different? Data, Artificial Intelligence, and Robots with Jed Kolka, Shivani Nayar, and Siddhar Suri. If you haven't already registered, you can find the link to the right on the INET website. Please follow INET Live at INET Economics to hear about new episodes and information as we develop the new series on the future of work. Thank you all very much, and see you next week.